So it's a great pleasure to introduce our two guests. It's not often that we have two people come and give a paper at the same time, so that's one bonus. The second bonus is that it's not often we get someone coming hot off the back of a brand new book that's just been published. Donna tells me that if you buy this online, it would be $40 to $45, but if you buy it today, it's only $30. So for those of you interested, that is a bargain, I would say, for an academic book in this day and age. I will confess to not having read it, but it looks to be a wonderful piece of scholarship that also blends something that's all too often not done about these kinds of crises, because it blends in very personal narratives and stories that are documented in here about people's lived experience and experiences of the various sieges against Fallujah. Anyone who's kind of watched Iraq even casually over the last 15 years or so will have heard of Fallujah. It's of course where there were two major confrontations in 2004, and more recently, it was a real hub of a lot of the protests against the Maliki government, and also was taken over by the Islamic State at one stage and then liberated a couple of years later. So it's a city that in recent times has certainly suffered a great deal and isn't enough, I don't think, on the international radar, and that's really where the book comes in to fill in that kind of gap of bringing the stories of Fallujah back into the public sphere. So we have two of the authors. Unfortunately, my good friend Richard, who's the other author, couldn't be here today, he's otherwise occupied, but we have two of the authors. Donna is going to speak first. Donna Mulhern is an Australian writer and activist, and she in fact was an eyewitness in April 2004 of the first of the two attacks that year, the first of the two major sieges against Fallujah. And she's been back several times. She was also a part of a Human Shield effort at one point, and has been involved in various other peace activism activities. She's the author of a memoir about her time as a Human Shield. It's called Ordinary Courage, My Journey to Baghdad as a Human Shield, which is published in 2010. And she's recently completed her master's degree at the University of Sydney Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies. Ross, who is the lead author of the book, is a PhD student in history at the University of Massachusetts. It's a pretty big accomplishment to be a PhD student and the lead author of a book, so he's obviously doing very well. He, in fact, was in Fallujah in a very different capacity, one might say on the other side of the fence from where Donna was. He was there as a US Marine who participated in the second siege of Fallujah. And of course, I think he will speak for himself, but it appears as if that experience really galvanised his understanding of the conflict and his activism as an anti-war campaigner. And he's also doing another project, the People's History of Fallujah, a digital archive. So perhaps he'll tell us more about that in the discussion time. So our guests are going to speak for about 10-15 minutes each, and then we'll open up the floor for discussion. So thanks.
Great, thank you, Ben. Thank you, everyone, for coming and taking an interest in this topic, which we obviously feel is a very, very important topic. I'm just going to give a fairly general introduction to the book and its major arguments, and Ross is going to get a bit more specific into one of the key arguments of the book. So, and also the concept of people's history. So that in itself, I think, is an interesting take, an interesting way to look at a topic. We've noted that there are many books out there on Fallujah, quite a few, and most are written by former soldiers, military historians or corporate journalists, and they all tell a particular view of the sieges of Fallujah, and we are challenging those narratives in our history. Those narratives rarely incorporate Iraqi voices into those books and viewpoints, and so in our book the Iraqi views and Iraqi point of view is central, or we've tried to make it central, both in our commentary and analysis and in the way that we've weaved personal stories through the book as well. So Ross might talk a little bit more about that, the concept of people's histories, because I think it's very interesting in general. So I think we're very fortunate to have Ross with us. So just so happens he's in Melbourne for study on another topic. So we were able to grab him and do these talks. So that's great. Ross and I actually met personally for the first time yesterday. So we've written a book over Skype and email for the last 5 years. So including with Richard as well. So many Skype calls. So the book had a few origins really. Each of us were working and interested in the topic of Fallujah independently of the other for many years. So for me, I would say that I kind of was working towards this goal for 7 years, and probably Ross a similar time frame, and we joined forces along the way at some point about 5 years ago. But you could probably count on one hand the people in the world who are really focusing on Fallujah in a very specific way. And so we're generally reading each other's materials and quoting each other and drawing upon each other's research. And so that's what we were doing. So Richard and I were very much using a lot of Ross's experiences to draw upon. And eventually we decided we might as well team up and join together. And so it's an activist, an academic and a soldier, a former soldier. So it's, I think, quite unique viewpoints that we're drawing together. And certainly my viewpoint is being an eyewitness and being in Fallujah a few times, and Ross's in being on the other side of how Fallujah was presented to him as a Marine. And the US Forces, I think, is particularly interesting and unique point of view. So we're really happy to have brought this together, which I think means quite a well-rounded book. And Dr. Richard Hill, who's has great interest in Iraq as well. So I'm just going to mention a few of our, in general, key arguments and flip through a few images here that will bring up a few more topics before I hand over to Ross. But we're arguing that the sieges of Fallujah, we're saying that there are 3 sieges of Fallujah. So 2 in April, first one in April 2004, then November 2004 by US forces, and then the 3rd siege of Fallujah in 2014 by the Iraqi government, and that they were all sieges in terms of the city being encircled, closed off and attacked. We're arguing it as a result of those 3 sieges that were so extreme, all 3 of them in their nature and level of violence, that the result is a cumulative result of those sieges is a case of herbicide, the killing of a city. And we are saying that because we believe that Fallujah was damaged in ways that are irreversible, and that the city will never be the same again, and it will not be able to resemble its former self pre-2003. And we are arguing that for a number of reasons, which are all through the book, and we'll touch upon a few of those today. So that's how extensive and serious we are arguing that these 3 sieges are. We're comparing, of course, to other cities where there's been sieges and where those cities have been able to recover and return to life as it was. We are saying that Fallujah is unable to do that. We argue in the case of sociocide, which is a very interesting concept, and a concept that we hope that others will move forward and take forward. And so the destruction of an entire way of life. So not only are we talking about a physical destruction in the city of Fallujah in terms of its building and its infrastructure, and that did happen to an extraordinary scale. So that's there, the physical destruction, but the fact that the way of life, the cultural way of life, traditions, etc., were interrupted, and to a degree many have not been able to be resumed. And so sociocide, the killing of a way of life. And then, of course, ecocide. Many of you would have heard of the very disturbing increase in the incidences of birth defects and stillborn births in Fallujah district, and they are still happening to this day. As we speak, there's posts by staff in Fallujah Hospital that they're putting out on social media, because now that is the only voice they have in trying to get awareness of this issue, about birth defects happening still to this day, in such a dramatic increase. And we investigate that in the book. It's a very confusing and complicated topic. There's a lot of allegations out there. What we try to do is analyse and look at the research that's been done and bring it all together and just put it out there and argue that more research needs to be done and more resources needs to be put into this issue of investigating what is going on in this city. Something very serious is going on, and we are arguing that it's related to, that it's toxic pollution related to the sieges in that city, and we can go into that in a bit more detail later. So a case of ecocide. So put those three together and it's a pretty dire situation in Fallujah today. We also have some key arguments about the significance of the sieges of Fallujah, namely that we believe the response to Fallujah in 2013 and 2014 by the Maliki regime is linked to the rise of Islamic State. We believe that the rise of Islamic State in Iraq was not inevitable in any way, shape or form, especially considering the state of that group in 2013 and 2014, which was not significant in relation to other groups, and that we would argue that the Iraqi government's response to the 12 months of peaceful protests in Ramadi and Fallujah in 2013, and the response to that and subsequent events ultimately provided the conditions for Islamic State to gain ground and flourish in the Anbar province. And so, it's quite a serious and quite a serious allegation to make and an argument, but we argue that very strongly and I would say very well. So I'm just going to flick through some of these images and maybe just touch on a few of them. As was mentioned, I was there in 2004 because I was in Baghdad at the time as part of a group of Western independent human rights observers. I'm a journalist by trade, so I was just writing a lot of observing, and we were called, this was the first siege of Fallujah, maybe had been going for 5 days. We got a call from Iraqi doctors who knew some of our group, who said if you want to observe what's going on breaches of human rights, and you need to come to Fallujah. They're calling a ceasefire tomorrow, you need to get yourself in here and see, because they're shooting our children. And our response was, settle down, don't exaggerate too much, don't be alarmist, thinking they can't be shooting children, don't exaggerate too much. And they said, well, come and see. So we came in, and within minutes we were in an ambulance that was shot at by US forces. And the breaches of the Geneva Conventions that we noted just in 3 years was extraordinary. And the breaches of the Geneva Conventions in the first and second sieges of Fallujah by US forces was to such an extent that operations would not have been able to function had they attempted in any way to adhere to Geneva Conventions. They would not have been able to continue those operations. So as you could probably see the bullet holes in this ambulance here. And we did see the targeting of civilians on the street, so it was as if the orders were for the snipers placed on top of the rooftops of buildings and mosques and churches was to basically shoot anyone that moved, regardless of their status. And unfortunately, that's what came out, what we saw. Fallujah City Hospital in the first attack was closed down within days, and that's because the Iraqi doctors there were being contacted by media, and they were reporting the extent of civilian casualties to the media. That was causing outrage and alarm in Iraq and the rest of the world, and US forces shut it down. They did not allow Iraqi civilians then to be treated in their own hospital, so then the doctors came out and they set up camps, little makeshift clinics around Fallujah, where we were stationed at one of them trying to help them out. They had very little electricity, on and off obviously. They did surgery by torchlight or candlelight, kicked their blood in a coke machine, and had no anaesthetic. And so this little boy comes in, he's shot through the head, and the doctors do their best, of course, but he doesn't have a chance, and he's gone. Therefore, I would not have believed it myself if I had not seen this repeated multiple times, and the bodies of the children were at my feet on the footpath outside of the clinic. And it was extraordinary, and my friends and I therefore called it the massacre of Fallujah. This is a woman, gunshot through the head. As I said, of course, the argument was that Fallujah was full of terrorists at the time. The civilians weren't present in there. On the contrary, there were actually thousands and thousands and thousands of civilians still in the city in the middle of both sieges. And obviously this is clear to see that this is a woman. Here's a little girl. And it was just going, I'm not going to show any more. They're quite distressing, more photos that I have, but you could imagine it's just on and on and on and on and on. Al Jazeera was one of the few media who were present. We met only other 2 foreign medias, and they were French, Western media, and otherwise the stories like this weren't getting out to the extent that we wanted to, except by Al Jazeera, and of course then the US forces shut Al Jazeera down. This is my friends and I. We just did a mission to try to deliver aid. We were shot at 4 times by US forces by trying to deliver aid to a quarter of the city that was under attack. And so, of course, many people who needed to flee the city ended up living in tents. All these families have a story, and quite horrifying stories about fleeing and losing their houses and ending up living in tents. Of course, the greatest victims of wars and attacks like this are always women and children and families who are caught in the crossfire. It's always the same story. But the numbers of this, it was quite extraordinary. I have some little vignettes in the book where I tell some of the voices, sharing some of the voices of these people. This is one, her name is Sarah. She was very angry, very articulate about what she thought about what was going on. Some children here, again, just the innocent faces of the people caught in the brunt of all this. This is called Martyr Cemetery. So this place is Fallujah City Football Stadium. During the first attacks on Fallujah, there were so many bodies to be buried that the cemetery overflowed, and they needed to dig up the football stadium as an overflow cemetery. And so that's what they call Martyr Cemetery. So everyone buried in their death is somehow related to the sieges of Fallujah. And even till now, so these 3 fresh graves here in 2013 when I was there, were related to Iraqi government attacks on the city, and so they're considered the martyrs, connected because they connect all of these sieges as one. They do not see separation between these 3 attacks. And we would argue as well that each siege and attack on Fallujah set the conditions for the next one, including the final one of the Iraqi government siege. And we find it it's almost breathtaking that the US military and other commentators did not see that each siege set the conditions and the context for the next one. It was extraordinary that wasn't seen. So this is Dr. Samira Alani, who we consider to be one of the heroes of the stories of Fallujah. She almost single-handedly brought the issue of birth defects in Fallujah to the outside world. So she's a paediatrician based at the City Hospital and started noting the increase in birth deformities because she was the one there dealing with it. It was her own work, literally recording in a notepad the increases. There was no system, there was no official response. So she just kept, her and her staff just keeping the records and the extraordinary increase and the unusual cases also that were occurring. She tried to grab the attention of the world, the Iraqi government, the World Health Organization. And then we note in the book the degree to which this issue was politicised is extremely disturbing, especially by the World Health Organization, who at first refused to do any, because you would expect that there would be, to such a crisis, a response in terms of investigation, study, exploration, what's going on here. To the extent that did not happen, and that the World Health Organization was complicit in that is quite alarming. And it's very explicit. It was quite obvious what was going on. But Dr. Samira, to this day, is the one documenting those cases. When I was there, I spent 2 weeks at the hospital, both in 2012 and 2013, and probably 4 cases a day. So that was 100% of the births were born with birth defects. If you're a woman of childbearing age in Fallujah today, Dr. Samira says you probably won't give birth to a healthy child. Her advice to women of childbearing age is just don't fall pregnant, because it's so unlikely that your child will be healthy. Of course, women are not taking that advice because their goal is to have a family, and that they will try regardless. And so there's a lot of heartbreak in Fallujah. So this little boy's, he's had congenital heart defects, so he lived to about 3, but then their life revolves around getting him medications in Turkey or Jordan and constantly travelling in and out of the country for medical operations. And I tell some of these stories in the book. This is a little boy named Saif. He had water on the brain and a few other conditions. His parents, under the stress and trauma of all this, separated and divorced. As you could imagine, the stress on families, because just with this extra load and not having the resources to be able to cope with these issues. Again, these are just some images. This is a woman who I sat with I wrote her story in the book. I think my opening line is, I've never seen a face as sad as a woman watching her new baby die, but this is this woman's face on this particular day, and it's quite overwhelming, and that the extent of this issue in this community and the impact that it's happening, and of course equipment, etc. is not available to the extent that it should be. So I'm standing at the grave here of this young couple. This is their third baby that they've buried, and they're not going to try for any more. So their first baby was stillborn, their second lived 3 days, and this was their third, he lived 2 days. So again, just a healthy young couple. And so they're going to give up. So we have, this is intergenerational warfare in a way. So these babies are dying of a war that they now saw, and this is not going to stop. This just will continue for a very, very, very long time. These graves are martyrs' baby graves. They're also buried in martyrs' cemetery because they are considered to be victims of the sieges, the US sieges of Fallujah. We can go, if you'd like to bring this issue up again when we have a discussion about what our theories are for the causes of this. We're very happy to go into that in a little bit more detail. I won't go into more detail with it right at this moment, but because we have a few theories. So the conditions in Fallujah in 2012 and 13 were very much, the city was still crumbling, had not been much repair or investment done by the Iraqi government, so people were still living in these very poor conditions. Of course, if you were in Fallujah after 2004-05, it became an open-air prison. It was encircled, you couldn't enter, go in and out of the city unless you had the retina of your eye scanned. And so it's very difficult to actually find out what was going on in the city, and very few foreign journalists could actually get in the period from 2004 onwards. So it was literally like living in a prison. Most people couldn't get out. If they wanted to just get out to go to university or to go to work, some days it wouldn't be possible. Other days it might be, but you were waiting 5 hours. It was just quite extraordinary. So these, finish off with these images, and that is from 2013. I was back in Fallujah, and of course that was when some would call it the Iraqi Spring, others have other names for it, but the non-violent protests that occurred on the highway between Jordan, blocked the road between Jordan and Baghdad for a 12-month period. So this was outside Ramadi, and you could not see the end of the people. This is standing up on the bridge. So they estimated about a 250,000 to 500,000 each Friday, and obviously that wasn't just them coming from Anbar province and Ramadi and Fallujah, but from all over Iraq. And so there was a lot of solidarity showed from other places in Iraq towards the people of Anbar province. And so you will have clerics and others come from Basra, Najaf, Karbala, and other places to show the solidarity and support. So they really wanted to break that kind of ethnic religious divide and say we're standing together as Iraqis together. The people of Anbar province had put together what would be like a log of claims, just saying we would like the Iraqi government to stop doing this, 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 this and this. It's mainly in relation to extreme human rights violations, arbitrary arrest, torture, extreme discrimination, etc., etc. And so it was quite, when you look at the claims on paper, they're actually quite toned down and legitimate, and anyone would go, well, why wouldn't you grant these things to this population and stop torturing, stop arbitrary arrests? When they turned up at a man's house who they wanted to arrest, if the man wasn't present, they would arrest his wife and put his wife or his sister into prison, of course, where she would be raped. And so this was happening to an extraordinary extent, and they just said, stop locking up our women who are innocent and raping them. So that was the sort of things. And so these non-violent protests, this camp was extraordinary, as I said, barely reported, I would say, in the Western media. They're not entirely their fault, because Maliki did not allow foreign journalists in. He cut off the highways so that the media could not gain access to these Ramadi protests every Friday. And so it didn't get a lot of coverage outside of Iraq, not to the extent that it should have. And so that was a great shame. but non-violent every week. It was set up like a town, really. There were restaurants and hotels, and there was people living there, and schools and soccer matches, and it was, as I said, I've never seen anything like it, to the extent that it was organised and disciplined, and non-violence was very, very impressive. The tribal sheikhs and the leadership were very insistent on the non-violent approach, and you had Islamic State literally circling this camp, just egging them on for violence and saying, you know, mocking them, saying, look at you every Friday, you come out with your non-violent peaceful protests and look at the response that you get, come and join us, you know. And so, but for 12 months they persisted, and this is just an average Friday. And of course we know the result of what happened, Maliki dismantling the protests, the peaceful protests, and assassinating some of the leaders, and then the rest is history in terms of Islamic State's entry into Fallujah. So we might talk about that period is very crucial period of time in this story, so it might be interesting if then later on during our discussion we might be able to come back to that. But obviously we are arguing that this was a pivotal time, not just in the history of Iraq and the Middle East, but obviously in the history of the world because of the impact of Islamic State has had, historically speaking. So I might leave it there, but Ross is going to speak about a few other points that we're talking about that make the sieges of Fallujah quite extraordinary, and it is the way that they were shaped, not only in a military fashion, but shaped in what we would call information warfare, and the way that the people of Fallujah were victims of the othering and Orientalism to quite a large extent. So I'll hand over to Ross.
Just one quick thing I want to address before I dive into my presentation. I'm not sure I can take credit as the main author of this book. Like Donna said, we brought very different things to the table in writing this book, done with great difficulty over Skype for a period of 5 years, so it's not easy to quantify who contributed the most. So by my eyes, it was a collaborative writing process, so just, with that said, no, that's not mine. That's what I'm saying.
Pull that one out.
I want to talk to you guys about this is basically chapter 4 in the book, focusing on the information operations, which I'll explain in more detail in a bit. For our purposes right now, we can just think of it as propaganda information. And so there's a lot of cliches and metaphors about the use of information in warfare. Everyone says truth is sort of the first casualty of war, or information gets weaponized. And to some extent, this is always true in warfare. It's been going on for thousands of years. Armies often exaggerate their victories and demonize their enemies. So in these first 3 ways, the use of propaganda in Fallujah is quite typical of most warfare. But in these last 2 ways, I think it's unique. There hasn't been enough attention to this yet, and it's worth discussing a bit. So I want to argue that the propaganda was actually in many ways constitutive of the violence itself, and that it extended the violence into a battle space, which I'll explain more in a minute. A bit of background, so these doctrines of information operations involve earlier doctrines, from Cold War doctrines meant for a land war against the Soviet Union in Europe. The notion of full spectrum dominance just means that the army sought to be dominant in every aspect of warfighting, land, air, and sea, and including intelligence and the information realm as well. But then with the advent of the information age, suddenly this notion of soft power picked up a lot of traction, and military scholars and planners became really obsessed with this notion of soft power. And after the first Gulf War in 1991, there was just all this almost a sense of thrill about these new high-tech weapon systems utilizing these new information technologies, the smart bombs, and all these other new military communication technologies. And this led to what a lot of people were calling a revolution in military affairs, a lot of new doctrinal and organizational structure within the military as a result of these new military technologies. So this led to a doctrinal publication in 1998, the Joint Publication for Information Operations. And I have a passage from this. So offensive I/O, information operations, involve the integrated use of assigned and supporting capabilities and activities mutually supported by intelligence to affect adversary decision makers and achieve or promote specific objectives. These assigned and supporting capabilities and activities include, but are not limited to, operation security, military deception, psychological operations, electronic warfare, physical attack destruction, and special information operations, and may include computer network attack. Offensive I/O may be conducted in a variety of situations and circumstances across a range of military operations and may have their greatest impact in peace and in the initial stages of the crisis. Beyond the threshold of crisis, offensive I/O can be a critical force enabler, that's an important word, for the Joint Forces Command. Offensive I/O may be conducted at all levels of war, strategic, operational, and tactical, throughout the battle space. Now I want you to note that this definition does not include public affairs, which will become important in a second. And the battle space is more than the traditional field. It now includes cyberspace, the media of communication, and the places where information is produced. So, in Iraq, information operations led the U.S. military to conceive of its relationship with the news media very differently. They began to think of it as a strategic enabler or a force multiplier for the purpose of perception management. And you have to appreciate how radically different this is from the relationship that they had with the media during the Vietnam War, for example. They basically considered the media a nuisance that was constantly getting in the way of them doing what they thought that they had to do. So here's a quote from Stephen Badsey from his essay, Bridging the Firewall, Information Operations and U.S. Military Doctrine in the Battles of Fallujah. So U.S. troops in Iraq were being trained to view their relationship with the media not as a constitutional or ethical issue, but as an aspect of warfighting and as a tool enabling them to accomplish their self-defined missions more effectively. So the ways in which they were going about their information operations were they were embedding journalists with military units, and this was a public affairs operation. They were creating these press information centers, which were basically these staged places where they could have press conferences, and there would be a military spokesperson at the podium. He'd have complete control over the narration and the choice of vocabulary to describe events in Iraq. And journalists would be in a more sort of like passive role, sitting there asking questions. It would already be determined whether or not they had access to these meetings, and a lot of times they were briefed before the meeting on the kinds of questions that they could and couldn't ask. Again, this was a public affairs operation. Sponsorship of Iraqi media companies like Al Iraqi News to help disseminate positive messages and images about the role of the occupiers in the country, and misinformation as psychological operations. Now, the reason public affairs was not initially included in that definition of information operations is that there are different ethical guidelines governing the sort of messages the U.S. military can direct at domestic audiences as opposed to foreign audiences. Public affairs is supposed to direct messages at domestic audiences, and according to the Smith-Mundt Act, it's not allowed to misinform the American public. Information operations, on the other hand, is directed at foreign audiences, and there's much more lax guidelines according to the veracity of the information flowing through information operations. However, as we began to see in Iraq, there was a lot of blurring between these two boundaries, or what they would call the traditional firewall between these different disciplines. So Fallujah was a very particular context because initially the U.S. military gave it no strategic importance at all. They just sort of flew right by it on the way to Baghdad. And they didn't send troops there until about a week after the initial invasion. So on April 23rd, 2003, they sent the 82nd Airborne to Fallujah. And within 5 days, there was a Bloody Sunday-like event where there was unarmed population protesting the soldiers who had taken over a school building, just because they wanted the school to be opened back up. And it's not really clear what happened. One journalist thinks someone from the crowd had thrown a shoe, and one of the soldiers probably overreacted and fired into the crowd with a machine gun, gunned down, killed 13 civilians and wounded several dozen others. So this forever changed the relationship between U.S. forces and civilians in Fallujah. This was the inciting incident of the insurgency in Fallujah. And over the course of the next year, things continued to escalate until March 31st, 2004, when 4 U.S. mercenaries were ambushed as they were driving through Fallujah hung from the bridge as war trophies, and these rather gruesome images were captured on camera, broadcast around the world, creating a lot of outrage. You're probably familiar with this particular incident, it became quite famous. This prompted the first siege of Fallujah on April 4th, 2004. It was a really hastily planned operation, just prompted out of a spirit of revenge to sweep through Fallujah and clear out all insurgent forces. But in the course of the operation, they killed over exactly 749 civilians and caused a lot of destruction to the city. However, the Al Jazeera media network was able to place a broadcast crew within the city, and they captured on camera a lot of the crimes that Don was talking about, and that created so much international outrage, the U.S. forces were forced to withdraw from the city and negotiate a retreat. The lesson that the U.S. military learned from this, however, is not that they should not launch major offensive operations in densely populated areas, but as Colonel Baylor puts it, by the end of April 2004, the MEF, the Marine Expeditionary Force's lack of a robust public affairs and information operations activity had become obvious in relation to the effective efforts of the insurgents, read Al Jazeera, who they regarded as an insurgent media network. So the MEF placed new emphasis on those techniques, and they began to figure much more prominently in the scheme and maneuver than they had in the initial operations order. So they then went forward with, they launched a major inter-siege information operations campaign to prepare for a coming second siege in November of 2004. So in this campaign, first there was a rhetorical shift from describing the insurgent forces as Ba'athists, diehards clinging onto the hopes that they might return the old regime, to now characterizing them as Al-Qaeda associated terrorists, led by the insurgents, by the terrorist leader Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. They then, whereas in the first siege of Fallujah, they only had one single journalist embedded within a military unit, they then took measures to make sure that there was no independent media in Fallujah for the second siege, and they embedded 91 journalists within U.S. military units to make sure that they completely dominated the production of information and images coming out of Fallujah. At around the same time, they also launched a psychological operation to exaggerate the role of Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, the alleged leader of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, claiming that he was in Fallujah, using the city as a base from which he was recruiting an army and launching attacks all across Iraq. This Zarqawi became the casus belli for the second siege of Fallujah. In fact, the demand that coalition forces made on the leadership in Fallujah was that to avert the second operation, they would need to turn over Zarqawi to coalition forces if they wanted peace. However, there's not a shred of evidence that Zarqawi ever even set foot in Fallujah. This was totally fabricated. No one in Fallujah has ever seen this guy. There's not a single photo. There's not a bit of evidence saying that he was ever in the city. It was an impossible condition on peace. So it was leaked in 2006 to the Washington Post that they were conducting this PSYOP in 2004. The U.S. military claims that it was a PSYOP directed at Iraqis in order to elicit a xenophobic response, because Zarqawi was a Sunni extremist who hated the Shia and wanted to provoke a war to the end of days against who he considered to be apostates, right? And they did that because they wanted to fracture the cooperation between Sunni and Shia elements of the insurgency at that particular time in 2004, which they found very threatening. It's not clear that they convinced any Iraqis at all, at least not in 2004. Later, I think it became sort of like a conventional wisdom, but that was after some time. In 2004, Fallujans in particular thought it was totally made up. They'd never seen this guy. How could they possibly be convinced that he was in their city? Yet, Americans were convinced very deeply that Zarqawi not only posed an immediate existential threat to U.S. forces in Iraq, but also to them on the home front as well. So the intended audience wasn't convinced at all, and there was serious leakage from this PSYOP into what would be the domain of public affairs, convincing the American public of something that just fundamentally wasn't true, a complete lie. During the course of this campaign, also a number of non-doctrinal concepts emerged as well. So a non-doctrinal concept would be a sort of a spontaneous concept come up by commanders in the field to meet the particular needs of the battlefield that they were dealing with. So one was that the U.S. had to avoid crossing the I.O. threshold. And the I.O. threshold is just the point after which the media becomes interested in human rights abuses. The one particular point of concern was civilian casualties. Of course, that might cross the I.O. threshold. So to avoid that, they launched this PSYOP telling all civilians that they had to leave. They dropped leaflets and they broadcast messages from loudspeakers telling everyone who was not a military-age male that they had to flee the city because there was going to be a major bombing campaign. Military-age males, however, were not allowed to leave the city. Another non-doctrinal concept was the notion that they had to respond to I.O. challenges. Again, I.O. challenges would be civilian casualties. And one challenge would be people who produced or disseminated information about the number of civilian casualties. The hospital, for example, was releasing the names and numbers of people who had been killed by U.S. airstrikes. So the very first target during the second siege of Fallujah ended up being the Fallujah hospital. U.S. soldiers kicked down the doors, threw the doctors in cuffs, and then from that point on, had a constant presence in the hospital because they considered the staff to be insurgent sympathizers who produced propaganda at their behest. And then during and after the siege, there were efforts to assist a number of military writers. Bing West in particular was embedded as not necessarily a journalist, and maybe not quite a historian either, something in between. But he was with troops writing a frontline account, and then later the public affairs liaison officer assisted a number of authors in writing military accounts of these operations. And until our book, these were the only books that were available on the sieges of Fallujah. And I have to say that the information operations were quite successful, and this is why we still live with this mythological account of the second siege of Fallujah as a liberation, as an American victory against Al-Qaeda and al-Musab al-Zarqawi's network in Fallujah. And that's why we went into this war with ISIS as misinformed as we were about the nature of ISIS, their links to these earlier insurgent groups in Iraq, and possible solutions to that conflict. So Bing West wrote that the rationale for stopping the attack in April was a perception that the damage being done was too great. In the month of April, 150 airstrikes had destroyed 75 to 100 buildings. In November, the damage was vastly greater. There were 540 airstrikes and 14,000 artillery and mortar shells fired, as well as 2,500 tank and gun rounds. 18,000 of Fallujah's 39,000 buildings were damaged or destroyed, and yet it was celebrated as a victory. Not just a victory, but a liberation. It's incredible. So the conclusions is, as I was saying earlier, the information operations were actually constitutive of the violence themselves. It's not just an afterthought to the violence, like disseminating this legitimizing narrative. It in fact influenced the way leaders conceived of the very notion of victory, because winning hearts and minds, not just of Iraqis, but of Americans as well, became as necessary as defeating the enemy. And determined military targets, that's why the hospital became a target. That's why Al Jazeera was regarded as an insurgent media organization. And it completely invented a casus belli for the second siege, Zarqawi. And I think this is one of the main reasons why we chose to write within the genre of history that we did. Donna tells me that people's history isn't quite as a tradition as it is in the US. I can say a bit more about that later if anyone's interested. But the idea was to tell a bottom-up sort of history rather than like the other histories that I pointed to earlier that were assisted by the propaganda operations. In part of these information operations, the focus was always to foreground the experiences of the American soldiers and to relegate the Iraqi experiences to the background, if to include them at all. So, I mean, just like from an ethical perspective, Iraqis deserve to have their stories told, and we wanted to tell that story. But also, from my perspective as a historian, now the vast majority of primary source materials currently available were produced by these IO-linked institutions, whether it be news media organizations or the military itself, which has produced a tremendous amount of, maybe not as much as we would like, but a lot of documentation. They're some of the only sources currently available to us. And Iraqi voices provide an important balance to telling the story. And they're particularly informative on topics that American or Western journalists have had quite a lot of bias in documenting themselves. So the so-called civil war, which we argue in our book is probably better characterized as a dirty war. And like Donna was saying earlier, the emergence of ISIS in places like Fallujah and Ramadi. I think they lend a very corrective story to what has been told to us so far. So that's all I wanted to add for now, and I'm happy to talk about anything else in more detail.
Well, thank you both. It was very powerful and engaging and confronting a couple of presentations. So I'll just open the floor for any questions.
Ross, what did you see in Fallujah in the second scene?
I was just a private. I carried a radio, so nothing nothing that you wouldn't expect. It's quite a compartmentalized experience. All this information operation stuff, I had no idea what was happening.
Right.
I was highly misinformed, uninformed, had a sort of certain tunnel vision effect going on.
I saw photos at the time of phosphorus bombing and things like that. You weren't aware of that at the time?
I mean, I saw them being used. I saw them from the air. I didn't see what they landed on. I mean, there are legal uses of white phosphorus to create a smoke screen to mask troop movements. So, that's what we were told that they were being used for, to create a smoke screen. I didn't know that it was actually landing on people. And I guess, maybe I should have known better, because you do see that, they sort of just sway in the wind and they spread out over a great tract of land. And there's really no way that this can be regarded as a precision munition, especially in an urban context.
Yeah.
So I think maybe for that alone, we should be regarded with some suspicion.
I'm just wondering to what extent does the propaganda of the IO start to be believed by its own senior
I wonder about that
officers?
too, because Zarqawi became a sort of a conventional wisdom within the U.S. military. Right? We deeply believe that this man existed, that he was Fallujah. It's not even clear to me where this psychological operation was coming from. There was a ProPublica report that came out maybe a year ago in the U.S. talking about some of the record-keeping practices of the U.S. military, and after when a unit would cycle out of Iraq and go back to the States, they burnt all their records. So even if you want to do Freedom of Information Act requests, there's just not that much available out there. So yeah, we know that the psychological operation existed. I don't know which unit conducted it, or whether it was even a Marine unit.
But they must be aware that there's a danger of internalising their own propaganda. Presumably, when they think about this, there's one thing for public consumption. It's quite another if they start to actually internalise the myths that they've created for other audiences, and therefore that would obviously undermine their own strategic ambition.
I even remember a particular point in the operation where, this intelligence must have been coming from some intelligence or internal IO, whatever it was, but our commander started telling us, Zarqawi's just 2 blocks away. He's wounded in the leg, go get him.
What year was that?
Huh?
What year was that?
November of 2004. And I think he turned up a month later in a totally different part of Iraq. I don't think there's any reason to believe that he was in Fallujah during the 70s.
He was Jordanian anyway.
Yeah, he was Jordanian. He's Jordanian, and the amount of evidence that we have on his role in Iraq is quite slim. Enough so that I think we should even question his leadership position. He existed, he was in Iraq, that much we know. But there's just so much misinformation about him, it's hard to decipher what's fact and what's not.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation both over here. Iraqi citizen. I know what you're talking about, and I myself was a little puzzled by some of the information, because in 2003, after the U.S. invasion, definitely we were cut off. I lived in Baghdad, so we didn't know what's going on. Definitely no communication, radio, electricity, pure water, nothing. So we might have a couple of people who might come from different places and say, oh, do you know that what happened? So someone saw this or someone witnessed that. But I think there is sorry to say that, there is a gap. Because Fallujah is part of Ramadi, and definitely there are, if we're talking about modern Iraqi history, there were specific provinces who supported Saddam fully during the Ba'ath reign. These specific areas were polluted for other Iraqis. They were really privileged. They had their own rights fully. So just before 2003, we knew something was going on in relation to religious parties, specifically after the relationships between Iraq and Syria started reopening again, and everyone was puzzled because Iraq and Syria were full on real enemies. And then we discovered that the flow of religion or religious ideas were trying to control the national literature of Iraq. So again, sorry, going back to Fallujah. So what we knew during 2003 is that al-Basra, for example, fought for longer, I'm sorry, I cannot remember or recall the period of time, longer than Ramadi and Tikrit and Fallujah. Fallujah and Ramadi and Tikrit just, they didn't resist as much as the southern governments in Iraq, which was surprising because some governments are Shia, and they were definitely really destroyed and dehumanized by the former regime. And we were surprised that the followers and supporters of Saddam Hussein didn't resist. They quit easily, and the American troops get in easily. That was at the very beginning of 2002. Then they started to resist, and then went on. From Zarqawi, as far as I know, as an Iraqi citizen, I'm not definitely a politician, however, it definitely existed, and existed even before 2003. So we were aware that there was something happening in this triangle, Tikrit, Fallujah, and Ramadi, but we didn't know what's going on. And we started to see women who were wearing the cap. Many people who come from there having long hair. So there was something going on, but we didn't know. So I think there is a gap. There is a gap in what you have talking about and my own and personal and lived experience. But that's the thing. Yeah, I mean, I'm really happy to listen to both of you. Yes, because I missed that. I mean, we didn't have any type of communication to tell us what's going on out there. But yeah.
Sorry, I'm not sure I understand the gap.
So I think there's a question underneath all of that about sort of under the Ba'ath, the privileging of these Sunni majority places, particularly Fallujah, or Erbil generally, Tikrit and others, and how that fed into this kind of relationship with the state after 2003.
I mean, Fallujahans that I spoke with didn't feel privileged. In fact, felt quite persecuted under Saddam. True, Fallujah was also a garrison city. There was quite a lot of people from the military living in Fallujah. But they also had, as you know, there was a strong strand of Wahhabism in Fallujah, and they felt this sort of like affinity to this international sect of Islam, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that was quite threatening to Saddam. So there was a lot of people who felt that they couldn't fully express themselves as religious people in Fallujah, who felt persecuted and truly disliked Saddam, disliked him very much, from the information that we gathered in this book.
But I would say your view actually feeds in
quite
well. That's all noted in our book,
yeah.
Especially because we're trying to justify why Maliki would have such an extreme, brutally extreme and violent response to Fallujah in such an extended period. And the explanation for that, we argue, is because of Fallujah seen in this privileged situation, that the reality of that is out there for all to judge. And we covered this extensively, that we had to find a reason why Maliki was just so extreme in his violence. And we would argue that what you're saying would be the reason why.
Yeah.
Because of that pre-history, pre-2003 and 2003. And the reason why the Americans didn't why there wasn't conflict in 2003 is because the Americans didn't attack. It wasn't a fighting city, like the Basra was on the border, etc.
Yeah.
And so that was the reasons for that. But of course, Maliki's reign and his decisions made towards Fallujah was based on retribution and revenge. And so that explains why it was extreme to the point that we're documenting. So that would tie in exactly with what you're saying.
It is because definitely it's different from Crete.
Yeah, that's right.
They refused anyone to get in. The tribes started to control, and they said, okay, so that's it. We can control the city, and that's why they were separated. Like with Fallujah and Ramadi, it was different. I think they were not supported after 2003, as Crete, for example, was supported. That's why they were in between. It was in between. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, so that prehistory of 2003 impacted from 2004 to, so that's all related. We do quite cover that.
Definitely. Yeah.
A couple of huge differences. Basra was betrayed by America in 1991, the Sunnis in Basra, and secondly, in the invasion in 2003, it was the British that were in charge of Basra and the southern area. So that's, a big difference. And
Sorry, the difference?
Pardon?
What's the difference, sorry? That's in 1991.
Basra was betrayed by America.
After
Bush
the Kuwait
Senior-
invasion? After the first invasion?
When Bush Senior invited them, told them that America had their back if they rose up against Saddam, and they betrayed them entirely.
Yeah.
So that Basra area, the Sunni south, already had a history of resistance, if you like, to the Iraqi regime, and also the occupying force in 2003 was British, not American. It was the British who had command of Basra. So the fighting in Basra was against a different enemy from the fighting in the rest of
Was it important
Iraq.
to the nationality of the invader? Is it important, the nationality of the invader, whether British or
It's
American?
actually, yeah. The brutality of the American is much greater than the brutality of the British.
Definitely true, but there are still invaders.
Pardon?
There are still invaders. British
They're
or-
still invaders,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I don't think the British troops were as brutal as the American. Correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as I know, that's an important difference.
They're very different contexts.
Pardon?
They were very different contexts.
Also, a question, is Fallujah Shia, what do you call it, pilgrimage site? No.
I was interested, can I speak? I can't remember which of you said this, because I didn't note down who said what. Stupid old man. One of you, anyway, said that there was a demonstration of solidarity from Basra in Fallujah. How did that express itself, both in practical terms, what form did it take, and secondly, how did it express itself in psychological terms? Was it in terms of a religious solidarity or an Iraqi solidarity? What was the envelope in which it was cast?
I'll give two examples. One example in 2004, whenever there was a ceasefire in April and in November, though there wasn't many ceasefires in November, but in the April one, because of the outrage from across Iraq of what was happening in Fallujah, Basra and Shia communities in particular organised aid convoys to go into Fallujah, and they sent their clerics to lead these Shia clerics to lead these aid convoys to go in there and say, regardless of what divide anyone there is or whoever might create, that we coming here with aid to assist people, our Iraqi brothers and sisters in need. And so that happened, and I know it happened because I saw it, and to a degree it was reported as well. It wasn't just aid coming from Basra, Najaf, Karbala and the Shia south, but coming from all over Iraq was coming into Fallujah. So that's one example. So basically humanitarian, and it was a humanitarian gesture. And in 2013, when these non-violent protests
was held over a period of about 12 months, and every Friday there was the huge mass gathering. There would be leaders and sheikhs and clerics come from Basra and other places around Iraq to speak on the podium, to sit alongside. So there was there was leadership represented from around the country, calling on Maliki to cease this extreme discrimination against the people of Anbar province in terms of physical discrimination, arrest, torture, employment, etc. And fairness in terms of the Sahawa, which we haven't mentioned yet, and how that was reneged on, and just justice and fairness in relation to that. So the people from other provinces in Iraq thought, well, ever Anbar province is on fire and unstable, we all suffer. That means the whole country is unstable and there's political instability. And so they had an interest in there being some peace and instability within Anbar province, so that then would reverberate around the whole country. And so they were there, and they were not only for humanitarian concerns but also human rights concerns, and they were harking back to or looking for a period of unity. They were arguing that there could be unity, and they were trying to express that in these showings of support.
Two more examples from 2004. The new 2nd Iraqi Battalion during the first siege of Fallujah. And it's curious that the coalition forces decided to create battalions in the Iraqi military according to sectarian identity. The 2nd Battalion was predominantly Shia, and they refused to be deployed to Fallujah to put down or to assist the U.S. forces during the first siege, because they said they considered it a ploy of the occupiers to elicit sectarianism between people from Sunni provinces and people from Shia provinces. And then there's another example where there was a lot of collaboration between the forces in Fallujah and Muqtada al-Sadar's forces in Sadar city. They were actively sending units to Fallujah to assist in the insurgency.
The general idea is that Fallujah is Sunni, whereas Sadr is Shia.
That's true.
So that doesn't make sense on that.
Well, because
Sadr
at
is
that time, that sort of sectarianism just wasn't felt, and they were actively resisting that sort of sectarianism.
Yeah,
that's the point we're making.
Yeah.
That later, that those sort of sectarian animosities were elicited in many ways by the occupation itself.
Yeah, yeah.
But at that time, there was more of a nationalist Iraqi feeling that this was a nationalist resistance against the foreign occupation.
Right. Because usually the story about the
Yeah.
gestation of ISIS is disaffected by the Sunnis military who, rose up and formed ISIS. This is the usual story that I hear, even though...
Yeah, no, we tell a very different story.
Oh, good.
Well, it's just the facts that they're...
Does it involve that?
Well, I have the sense that we could talk a great deal more about this topic, because it's certainly very interesting, very complicated, but you have done a wonderful job of presenting very thorough research and very provocative research that certainly flies in the face of many conventional wisdoms that tell about the entire story of Iraq over the last couple of decades, really. And it's a tragic story, but one that needs to be told. So thank you on behalf of us all for coming and sharing your work. Thank you.